Shall we start? Or?
Start, yeah, and I'll keep an eye on there.
Okay. So hi everyone, welcome to the third episode of the Fabian Women Book Club. I'm Amy Dwyer, the Women's Officer for the Northwest Young Fabians, and today we're joined by Leslie Kern, author of Feminist City. So just to give you a bit of a background on Feminist City, I think this is a really important book. So many women sort of live in cities and have lived in cities all their lives, but feel vulnerable and out of place in large parts of it. So this book tells of female, LGBT+, ethnic minority and disabled exclusion in urban spaces, and some of the ways that community groups around the world have sort of come together and are attempting to reclaim the city. So I think there's some really important ideas raised throughout this book, and I'd encourage anyone listening who hasn't read it yet to definitely do so. So Leslie, I'd love it if you would introduce yourself and sort of tell us your motivations for writing the book and why you think creating a feminist and intersectional city is so important.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to this event. And it's really great to be here with you. So I'm coming to you today from Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, which is part of the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey people here. I am an associate professor of geography and environment and also women's and gender studies at a small university called Mount Allison University. It would be kind of comparable to your United States liberal arts college sort of environment. And I've been here for about 11 years now, but of course, prior to that, I lived in Canada's biggest city, Toronto, and also for a time I lived in London as well. And the reason that I came to write this book is that I wanted to take some of the conversations that I get to have in my day job as a professor, where I talk to other academics, colleagues, peers, and of course students about issues relating to cities. So everything from housing and gentrification to policing to poverty, suburbanization, racialization, migration, globalization, all sorts of big topics connected to cities. And I wanted to think about how could I bring these questions to a wider audience. And of course, as a feminist geographer, so someone who's concerned with questions of power in cities, and particularly how power plays out through the lens of gender, I wanted to offer kind of an accessible way of thinking about what feminism has to say about the city. I was interested in maybe humbly participating in some of the great public feminist discourse and writing that's out there right now. So from people like Rebecca Traister, who wrote All the Single Ladies, as well as Good and Mad, Rebecca Solnit, Roxane Gay, people who were writing about feminist issues for a wide audience. And I thought, well, maybe one of the things that I can contribute to that is to think about space and to think about cities as kind of part of a set of gendered and other kinds of power relations. So often we look at the cities around us as this kind of container. It's kind of always been there, it will always be there. And we don't really have an opportunity maybe to ask, how is power kind of saturated in the very bricks and mortar and asphalt of our cities? What does gender or sexuality or race or class have to do with the very physical environment around us? How does that influence our social relations? So how can we start to see the city as kind of like an active participant in all forms of kind of inequality and sorts of social relations? So my aim was to kind of take all of that sort of swirls around in my head all the time as an academic and to make it available to a wider group of people who are, city dwellers, as Amy mentioned, or just people who are really interested in these sorts of questions of how power works in different sorts of settings. I tried to incorporate some of my personal experience into the book as a longtime city dweller, as a mother in cities, as a woman, to provide sort of an entry point for how we can ask kind of feminist questions about urban environments. And also, as Amy mentioned, I did want to offer an intersectional perspective. So recognizing that I embody a certain amount of privilege as a white, able-bodied and cisgender woman who doesn't experience all of the same sorts of oppressions and inequalities as other groups of women and other marginalized people in the city. So it's not really a matter of saying, well, a feminist city is a city that looks like me and works just for people like me. I have to kind of look beyond that perspective and to see how sometimes whiteness and class privilege and able-bodiedness might actually be factors that are limiting either my ability to understand how others experience the city or could be actively contributing to the oppression of others in the city. So throughout the book, I try to incorporate the writings and viewpoints of other groups of people as well, so that we can kind of try to come to a sort of intersectional understanding and to recognize that, you know, gender is, I think, a really interesting and exciting lens to view the city through, but it's not the only one, and it's not sufficient on its own for thinking about inclusivity in a broad way. Maybe the last thing that I'll mention before we sort of move on to a more interactive discussion is that, of course, I wrote this book before COVID times, before there was a pandemic, before so many people living in cities and in many other places had their lives completely turned upside down. But of course, I've been talking about the book at all sorts of events during the pandemic. And I think some of the kinds of spaces that I talk about in the book, public spaces, the street, as well as the home, have really become places that people are starting to look at in different ways, as our abilities to use them in the ways that we've been accustomed to have been kind of radically upended. Either we've been not permitted to be in certain kinds of spaces, or we found that suddenly our home is now a school. It is now a workplace. It is now also a space of healthcare, right? It's all sorts of things all at once. And for some people, it's also a site of danger and fear and violence. So it's not a safe space. So there's many different ways that the pandemic has kind of shifted our consciousness, and I think it's offered an opportunity for, again, people who kind of have taken our built environment for granted as just sort of, it's just normal the way it's set up, this is just how it should be, and has, you know, really, again, by sort of flipping our normal use of space on its head, kind of been a moment where we can say, oh, like what could we do with public space? Can we have less cars, for example? How can we make green space accessible to everybody? How can we make our homes safer? How can we think about all of the care work that is necessary to keep society functioning? How can we think about, you know, spreading that out so it doesn't continue to fall so much on the shoulders of women and racial minority people who work in, you know, cleaning and food service and healthcare and so on. So it's just been really interesting to kind of see the book being received in this particular moment and the sort of conversations that are happening with that. And I think, if anything, the pandemic as a crisis has really shown us the importance of creating inclusive spaces and urban environments. So when I'm feeling optimistic, I like to think that this is a moment where we can reimagine many of our spaces for the better. So maybe I'll pause there and we can open things up.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the things as well that's kind of mentioned in the book is that we kind of recognize that cities might not be safe places for women, or that we are excluded or vulnerable, but we don't always necessarily recognize why. I think maybe because it's so ingrained in the way that cities are built, and also just society in general. So I think that's really important that's explored in the book. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat box and I'll read out the questions. But I'll start off with one if no one. Yeah, okay. So do you think the lack of women in stuff like urban planning is a supply or demand issue? Or do you think it's maybe a bit of both?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question. Well, I think, yeah, there's kind of problems at both ends of the system, if you will, in that I think women who have been interested in going into professions like planning and kind of maybe associated professions like architecture, design, civil engineering, and even urban politics have found those professions to be real old boys clubs, right? To be quite exclusive and to perpetuate many of the kind of worst harms of sort of historically male-dominated workplaces have been perhaps quite unwelcoming, both to women themselves and also just to different points of view that are inflected with, you know, other sets of experiences that don't kind of align with the typical kind of planning agendas. And I also wonder, and this is just sort of speculation on my part, that again, kind of from the other end, you know, are women interested in being part of these professions? I think the answer is yes, but as Amy sort of pointing out, this long history of women kind of being excluded from urban spaces or being told that cities are not really for us or are sort of scary places has maybe created a perception that this isn't like a realm of action for women, even though so much activism kind of has occurred in and around cities. So I think that representation in those professions from women and other minority groups is crucially important. It's not the end of the story of inclusion and transformation in cities, but I don't think that we can see the kinds of changes that many people want to see happen without those voices at the table, without different perspectives, without a strong kind of equity commitment within those groups.
Yeah, I agree. I think you don't always necessarily need to be like a woman to represent women's issues, but women are always going to be able to understand those issues better. But yeah, I think that supply and demand tend to be quite heavily linked. You know, you're not going to have the supply unless it's quite obvious that there's a demand for women in there.
Exactly.
Yeah, do you want to ask a question, Kelly?
It's a question or a comment, really. I think it feeds into a lot of what you just said, Amy, that a lot, when I think about kind of urban planning subconsciously, and I don't realise till I read the book, I do see it as a kind of masculine thing of working out where the cars go and all that kind of thing. And I didn't learn to drive till I was about 29, and I'd had a baby by then. And I felt, as a pedestrian pushing a pram, the city was or the town I live in, I should probably say, was absolutely not really built for me and my pram. It was always kind of cars parked on the pavement, so I had to take the buggy in the road, and you know, no spaces to take a baby to change. And I remember when I was heavily pregnant once, I couldn't find a public toilet, and I knocked on the doctor's door and they said, oh no, we're closed now. So I had to sort of limp home and stuff like that. And once I read the book, it kind of crossed my mind that it's very obvious when you look at it that towns are designed by able-bodied men, and that kind of cars, like the ultimate symbol of masculinity in many ways, are kind of the king of town planning in towns like where I live in Kent. So that was really just my contribution of it. Would never have crossed my mind growing up to think about women being involved in town planning, and I think it's probably the same for a lot of people. And actually, when you stop and think, yeah, why are towns built not for kind of family life? Most people are in a family.
Yeah, well, or family life is really presumed to be kind of quite confined to the home and a few other sort of narrow spaces around it. And yes, so much of the way that our transportation networks have been designed are, of course, very car focused and have been designed with the efficiency of getting one person from home to work in the central city at a particular time of day and along a very linear route. And that historically was the male breadwinner. And so the city is kind of set up quite well to make that trip efficient. But for anyone, yes, who's pushing a pram or who has to stop to drop children somewhere or to check on an elderly parent or to pick up something to get in for your dinner, you know, extra diapers, running all of those household errands, and probably also going to paid work, as most women do in their adult lives. The networks just don't, they don't fit that experience. You might have to pay multiple times to get on and off public transit. The routes don't run into residential areas at particular times of day. They're not physically accessible. They're not, you know, good or safe for children necessarily. They're not convenient. All of these factors make, you know, kind of women's just like daily life like so much more difficult. And yet much of that has been invisible because there has not been that sort of representation in planning and politics.
Yeah, I think when you look at the number of, let's just say, London tube stations that don't have step-free access, It's insane, and there's no need for it either. If those kind of people were actually given a voice and a seat at the table when we made these planning decisions, it wouldn't happen. I think that's something that probably affects almost all policy areas, just a lack of public consultation in every situation. So I guess, what would your like ideal feminist city look like? I know that in the book you kind of talk about it more from like what works against women or against CLPL, but what would your ideal city look like?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, this is something that I've, again, especially in the context of the pandemic and lockdowns, I've kind of had an opportunity to reflect on how the sort of, I guess, values and principles that I put in the book might look in a more concrete way, because I think one of the many layers of this crisis has been around questions of care work and where it happens, who does it, how it's valued or not valued, how it's paid, not paid, or underpaid, how it's supported through various social services, networks or not, and how our cities are set up to facilitate care work. And I think the answer has been, in most cases, they have not been, or there's just been an assumption that all of that care work that is so necessary just to keep us alive and functioning as a society is presumed to be done in the home. It's presumed that women or other caregivers will just take on that work for free, or it's presumed that we can pay people really terrible wages to do work that is often stigmatized. It's seen as dirty work, unskilled work, work that's only suitable for, youth or recent immigrants or people who have lower levels of education, or women, right? And so in thinking about that, I've kind of thought, okay, well, a feminist city to me has to be one that really prioritizes care work. So what does that look like? Well, it might look like interventions into transportation networks. Can we imagine transit networks, public transit, but also other ways of moving, pedestrian, bicycles, and cars as well, that prioritize care, right? And one example here would be, so in places like Canada, of course, I look out my window, there's a lot of snow. Are we going to clear the sidewalks of snow, right? This is an equity question. This is a care work question, right? It seems so kind of like, I don't know, basic in a way. It doesn't seem like this is a feminist question, but to me, it is a feminist question. Can you move around the city? Accessibility is another aspect to me of the feminist city, the caring, careful city, because if we can't actually physically get to or access the spaces that we need, and this can include things like toilets as well, which is not just about disability, but also about your gender identity. Can you find a toilet that matches your gender identity or is not gendered in a narrow and limiting way? And thinking as well about, how do we, and I don't have a simple answer to this, but how do we collectivize care so that it's not done in the little box that we call the single family home, right? That it's not only done in those spaces, but especially given the pandemic and the urging for people to take so much of our social lives outside, could we imagine more of our urban public spaces as places where we collectively feed people, as places where children go to learn, as places where we collectively can gather in safe and sociable sorts of ways? And many of our public spaces over many decades now have been increasingly kind of anti-public in many ways, right? Like they're anti-protest, they're anti-sitting, they're anti-homeless, they're consumption spaces. They're not really set up to bring the public into them. So to me, that feminist vision, again, what has really been elevated by witnessing and experiencing this crisis has been, what are all of the ways that this care work, the survival work of society, can really be valued and prioritized in the city?
Yeah, I think the work that women do definitely is undervalued, especially like care work. Something that you talk about in the book is sort of women coming together to sort of overcome the barriers that women face living in cities. And obviously that's really, really great. And women, shouldn't have to do that anyway. But I'm kind of wondering, how can we mobilize women to reclaim these urban spaces that kind of work to keep us out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's such a range of options, everything from broad protest, social movements, right, where people are literally out in the streets protesting for rights and access, and you know, over this past summer, seeing a resurgence of Black Lives Matter movement is a great example of kind of claiming public space and kind of bearing witness to the ways in which urban spaces have historically been so exclusive and, of course, white dominated in that case. For women, yes, we have a long history of public protest and social activism in cities, but of course there's also the very everyday kind of mundane ways that women might kind of take over public space, so or to claim a piece of public space. So one example that I can think of is cases where primarily women, I want to be gender inclusive, but primarily women or people who are nursing babies have been excluded from public spaces or told to leave a shop or a restaurant or something like that because they're nursing a baby, and in response multiple people have kind of taken to brought their babies to nurse them in public spaces to say, listen, no, this is a normal activity, don't you can't discriminate. So something like that is like kind of an everyday example, but also just you know, women kind of refusing to follow the rules of being, you know, the good girls who stay at home, who don't dress certain ways, who don't go out at night, all of those kinds of things that women have been told not to do. So I think kind of on a daily basis, many women are engaged in their own little act of protest just by like going about their day-to-day lives and not being so limited by all of the messages that we get that this space is unsafe for you or you don't really belong here.
Yeah, I think the Reclaim the Night marches are like a perfect example of that. So one issue that you could touch upon as well is gentrification, how, you know, although it's seen as like this really, really great thing to make cities safer and more accessible for everyone, it actually just works to push communities out of where they live. So how can we make like spaces in cities safer without doing that? How can we sort of reform gentrification to actually be a good thing?
So I'm actually, my next book is going to be about gentrification. So I suppose I could say, wait and see for the next book. No, but it is one of the kind of questions that I tackle because yes, you're right. I mean, on a kind of like in much sort of mainstream discourse about gentrification, we see a lot of like beautification, or we see, oh, like a cozy new cafe has opened up. These seem like really nice things. Who could be against, you know, a clean park and a nice cafe? But these can also be symbols of displacement of other people who are no longer as welcome in those spaces or who can't afford to live in the neighborhoods that are being changed. So to me, I don't know that there's a way to kind of reform gentrification. What I would like to think about is how can we ensure that everybody has access to good urban infrastructure, quality schools, good public transportation routes, green spaces in their neighborhoods, you know, good maintenance of their streets and roads, these kind of very everyday things that are some of the quote improvements that can come with gentrification, but usually it requires improvement because cities have kind of left these neighborhoods to sort of rot or to be very disinvested over time. So for me, I'm kind of more interested in thinking about what kinds of public provision of these, you know, services and infrastructure would really improve the lives for a majority of people. And to me, you know, part of that as well is supporting education. You have to support healthcare. You have to have good jobs. You have to have people not living in poverty, not struggling day to day. And to me, it's kind of less of like the top down of gentrification will make everybody's life better, but more like the bottom up of everybody having what they need to be safe, secure, well housed, and so on is going to be what makes every neighborhood better in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's actually like a much better way of looking at it. Sort of austerity kind of has made everything awful, and then gentrification is kind of like the capitalist way of solving that problem but not actually solving it, and just putting money into like rich landlords but not actually helping the people at the bottom. So I think increasing public spending and recognizing the value of like care work and education is a big step in that way. So have you noticed, obviously you were already aware of them because you talk about a lot of them in your book, but have you noticed that since writing that you've noticed so many more features of cities that work to exclude women? I know that obviously I have since reading it, but I was just wondering if there was anything that you'd noticed like additionally after reading the book. No, writing it, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. It's kind of funny because, of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, but I actually, where I live right now is a very small town. It's just 5,000 people, right? So I am not on a regular basis surrounded by the kind of urban environment that I write about in the book. For me now, that is more like when I'm traveling or if I'm visiting family and friends back in Toronto or other cities. So I kind of, it's an interesting sort of perspective to be in a very small town, rural environment, and to be thinking about these questions. I think what I have, I guess, noticed more of or has been brought to my attention is just in having these conversations about the book with a wider group of people is other people who are different from me being able to share their own experiences of the ways in which they felt excluded or powerless or unsafe in cities. I think one of the biggest lessons probably has been around policing. I think, in the book, I'm not pro-police, and I think I have an abolitionist kind of ethos, but again, since Black Lives Matter and the increased public discourse about things like defunding the police and what that means, that has really driven home for me how important a piece to me of the feminist city that is, in a way that I could have been more explicit about in the book if that had maybe been more front of mind for me. So kind of recognizing the ways in which policing is kind of tied into things like gentrification, for example, has really, I think, broadened my point of view on what the alternatives to that might be.
Yeah, I've kind of enjoyed talking about this with like male friends, and I think I'm not saying my friends are like this, but there's a growing kind of group of men that see misogyny as not a real issue and feminism as, kind of over now and it's done with. And it's interesting talking to them about cities and how women are kind of excluded in cities. They don't seem to accept it at all. They kind of say like, well, why? It's the same for everyone, and just not kind of recognizing these like entrenched just vulnerabilities that women experience, I guess, because kind of talking to men, sort of saying things like, when if you have like 3 men walking home, you wouldn't perhaps say to them, text me when you get home to make sure you got home safe, or you like wouldn't walk with like your keys out, or you wouldn't pretend like you're on the phone to someone. And I think one thing for me, I've noticed when I've been walking around like Manchester or Preston where I live, is the minute that your phone dies or it gets dark and you feel so vulnerable straight away. And we shouldn't have to feel like that in the places where we live. So I think this book is a great way of sort of raising the issues that we need to fix, but also it's the issue of like, how do we fix them? I guess I kind of want to ask, what can straight women as well, because obviously we don't kind of experience, especially straight white women and who are cisgender, don't kind of experience as much vulnerability in cities that other people might experience. How can we kind of act as allies and all kind of come together?
Oh yeah, that's such a great question. And I think one of the dangers that we've seen is that sometimes straight cisgendered white women are anything but allies, or that the prioritization of the safety of those women, or women who are assumed to be the majority of women, has come at the expense of the safety of other groups of people, including other groups of women in cities. So I think it's important to really recognize, for example, the privilege of feeling like the police make you safer, right? That is very much connected probably to your whiteness, to your class position, to being straight and cisgender. But for all sorts of other people, again, including other groups of women, the presence of the police is the opposite of safety. So in order to think about being an ally, to me, one of the questions that I like to kind of ask myself when I'm thinking about different kinds of urban interventions, if you will, or policies that we might come up with is, how would this affect the most vulnerable person, right? Like, not just how it would affect me, either make my life better or worse in some way, but like, if I think about the most or a more vulnerable person, like, how is this going to impact a sex worker, for example, right? Is it going to make her or his life less safe, right? Is it going to impact the conditions of their work? What does this mean for homeless or precariously housed people? What would this mean for people who have a physical or mental disability of some sort, right? Like what, so those are the kinds of questions that I try to ask. And I think that's part of allyship, is kind of looking beyond what feels good to you in the moment and sort of saying, what if we brought those people who are historically on the margins of the city, what if we kind of imagine them at the center, and what would a city that was safe and supportive and fun for them actually look like?
Yeah, and I mean, you saying that now, it seems like it's such like an obvious point that policymakers should be thinking of, and urban planners should be thinking, you know, how would the most vulnerable people experience the city? And it's so obvious that they don't think like that, because if they did, so many aspects of our cities would be so different. Is there anything that you wish you could add to the book now, or anything that you'd changed of looking back at it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, even before the pandemic, I had an interview with somebody who had read the book, and she just made this really interesting point that even though the kind of the concept of home is kind of woven throughout different bits of the book, I don't actually talk that much about the home in the book. And I think that, you know, if I was going to change something or add something, I might actually highlight the home, especially the single family home, as a kind of feminist urban issue. Again, one that has been like extra emphasized in the context of the pandemic, with all of its limitations, its violences, its, you know, unfair gender distribution of labor that's connected to the home. So I think that I would probably not center the home, but actually kind of be a bit more explicit about what I feel its place, or how we might transform the idea of the home under a sort of umbrella of the feminist city.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting idea, since, you know, the private sphere has been seen as anything but feminist in the past. I guess kind of linking onto that, and we did touch on this before, what do you think the recovery of COVID kind of means for the feminist city? Are we in a good position or a bad position?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the day, I kind of go back and forth on my answer to that question. You know, I think in a hopeful sense, I think it has been a moment where a much wider group of people are questioning what public space is for, right? Like how we have designed public spaces or not designed them over the last several decades, and their limitations in ways that they didn't really maybe notice before, when they didn't kind of have to think about how they were going to move through the city, how they were going to use urban spaces in different ways. So it's been a moment where policymakers and planners have been able to kind of do some of the things that they maybe have wanted to do but didn't feel they had the political support to do, like cut down on car space in cities, make more pedestrianized areas, widen sidewalks so that we can have more outdoor space. Although I always raise the question of, you know, do we, all of that expensive outdoor dining space, right? Who is that really for? But, you know, fair enough. Like questions about, you know, can we have more outdoor seating and socialization spaces? A lot of cities have removed so much seating from public spaces because they're afraid of homeless people sleeping or sitting in these spaces for long periods of time. So cities, they're not like very comfortable to be out in public in. We don't have enough public toilets for people to use. And again, if you're going to try to have a family out for a day in the park to be able to be socializing safely, like you need a bath. I mean, everybody needs a bathroom, right? So it's been a moment where we can imagine that we could kind of like reclaim public space for people, not for corporations, not for cars. So I'm very optimistic about that. And I think a lot of people have also been questioning, like, wait a minute, maybe everybody living in these like little units of the nuclear family home is not working out all that well, especially once like your children are stuck in there with you all day and you and other family members are all trying to work there all day and you're all trying to stay safe and healthy in this space all day, and we're all looking around like, oh God, is this all there is? Why did we set this system up like this? So maybe it's a moment where we will start to imagine more creative ways of housing people, and again, of kind of like sharing the care work that we all do in these little boxes of the single family home. So might be a good moment for kind of raising awareness of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think sort of seeing in London when they kind of installed outdoor toilets when you could like drink out on the streets and they only put urinals in. That was like, okay, it's only half the people. But yeah, we've had an interesting question from Emma. So she says that she really appreciates the idea of how anonymity in the city is a privilege for women, especially as sort of the home life can bring so many demands on women. Any ideas on how we can actively increase respect for women's autonomy and safety? So obviously we have like in some cities in, I think it's Japan, that have women only carriages on trains. And that's obviously a good idea, but how do we kind of change perceptions as well so that men don't harass women when they're in the same train carriage?
Yeah, exactly. It's such a good question and such a hard one to answer, because I like to think that if there were just kind of like design or space interventions that we could come up with to stop harassment, then we would have so far, or to make everybody safe. Like if there was a way to just have the perfect amount of lighting and the perfect amount of walkways and unobstructed views and the perfect amount of eyes on the street or whatever, then we would have solved this problem. So it's clearly not only a physical environment problem. Like we do need physical environment changes to help with safety, but it is also just a much broader like social and cultural problem that requires everything from kind of education to like a broad sort of public consensus. And I think, you know, it's possible, right? Like when we think about all of the kind of public messaging that we've gotten about different sorts of things over the decades that has changed behavior. So whether it's public messaging about like smoking or drink driving, or I'm trying to think of other kinds of things that we have kind of turned into socially unacceptable behaviors, or they're acceptable in very limited kinds of ways, right? Like, can we do this with things like issues of harassment? Because I'm kind of wary of going to the point of like criminalization of harassment, because I think anything that kind of expands like police powers in the street is probably going to be more harmful to more people than it is going to actually be helpful to women. I'll just say, I don't actually think the police really care about women's comfort and safety. So I think giving them like more powers to charge people for inappropriate behavior is just going to lead to you know, more targeted harassment of already vulnerable groups. So I realize I'm not really answering your question, because I'm just pointing out that this is one of those really like pernicious ones that I think requires like such a radical kind of overhaul of societal attitudes.
Yeah, I agree. I think architecture and sort of changing space can go some way, but I think it can't be the only thing, I guess. So we got another question. How do you think female friendships can impact, change, or challenge the divide between public private spaces? And do you think we'll see a further shift or blurring of currently denoted private versus public urban spaces?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's such a great way of putting this question around female friendships, to think about them as challenging that divide. Yeah, because so much of what has kind of the way in which we define the private is very much linked to the idea of the nuclear family, which has been linked to the idea of the patriarchal nuclear family, and the primary relationships in one's life being based on romantic and intimate partnership rather than other kinds of relationships and partnerships. So I think anything that kind of pulls that apart a little bit, or challenges its narrow boundaries, is something that also then kind of forces us to shift what we think of as public and private, or what we think of as the separation between those things. And yes, female friendship, I think, does challenge that as well. And as to whether we'll see a further shifting or blurring of public versus private, I mean, this to me is also one of the kind of aims of the idea of the feminist city, which isn't to say that there would never be any such thing as public or private, but the fact that we have boxed them off in particular ways has maintained a gender unequal status quo, right? When we think about the fact that we continue to rely on so much care labor being done in the so-called private sphere and in the single family home, that in order for that to change, I think we do have to change kind of our definition of both public and private, and of what the expected activities and roles and functions of public spaces are, right? We haven't really thought of urban public spaces as spaces where care work happens, but why not, right? Maybe we could think in that way, and that would really, yeah, I think shift a lot of things.
And that links to kind of what you were talking about earlier about kind of collectivizing care. And it's something that you mentioned as well, sort of where women can come together and share, you know, childcare and responsibility, so that, you know, like if women need to go and study or they need to go to work, it's not sort of just a burden on one person all the time. Actually, especially for like single mothers, that's really interesting. One thing that you kind of briefly mentioned before is anti-homeless architecture. It's kind of ironic for the people for who the city is literally their home are the ones who are kind of excluded the most by it. And obviously I don't want homelessness to be an issue at all. But how can we, until there's a political will to kind of solve homelessness, it's never going to really be solved. So how can we work to... Sorry, did I freeze then?
You did freeze there. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just kind of saying, how can we change perceptions to make it that anti-homeless architecture is not seen as acceptable in any situation?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so pernicious, and it's so interesting that people like people who are not experiencing homelessness, or who haven't had to think about the urban environment in that way, often don't even notice, right? It's so kind of integrated into design, and there's all sorts of tricky stuff that goes on to dissuade all sorts of uses of public space, whether it's playing, you know, I've heard examples of like places that will play music that teenagers don't like, so that teenagers won't hang out there, or that the lighting in a public toilet is such that somebody wouldn't be able to like find a vein to engage in like injectable drug use, for example, right? So there's all of these like really like subtle and sneaky and kind of awful ways that are meant to be like not even noticeable to the sort of quote unquote average person. So one thing is like making sure that we know about them, like that we can even notice them when they're happening around us, because it's so subtle that if you're not trying to find a vein in the bathroom, then you might never notice. Like might be like, why is the light blue? Maybe there's a blue light bulb. I don't know. Like that's, who knows? So yeah, I mean, I think part of it is changing this perception as well that homeless people are represent a sort of a danger, when I think in most places the crime data shows that homeless people are more likely to be victims of crime than to be perpetrators of crime. So there's an assumption that if you don't see homeless people, then somehow you're safer, but really it's kind of more the opposite, that homeless people are more vulnerable than, you know, your average non-homeless person on the street. So changing that perception really matters. I think, you know, I mean, one of the things about anti-homeless architecture is that it's extremely dehumanizing, right? And so this is bigger sort of question of like humanization or rehumanization of people who are, I think, seen to be very much less than or as kind of somehow fallen out of the category of citizen, of, you know, community member, and so on. So I think it's partly changing that perception. But yes, I mean, a good place to start would simply be by recognizing that, you know, people do need places to sit and to use the bathroom, and that actually if you kind of provide those spaces, then it probably creates a greater sense of safety for everybody, rather than trying to, like, you know, chop up and eliminate those spaces, which just pushes, I think, things further out to the margins, creates greater marginalization, creates greater possibility of danger and crime occurring.
Yeah, exactly. If there's nowhere sort of in the city centre where homeless people can find shelter, then they're going to look for areas that maybe aren't as safe, or spaces that aren't as safe to stay in. Kind of going back to what we were saying about COVID before, I was just thinking, I went sort of pick up a parcel in a shopping centre a few weeks ago, and it was all like the one-way systems, but they'd taken out all the benches because they didn't want people to buy food from like the cafes and eat inside, which is totally fine, but taking away all the benches. I was with my mom who has like mobility problems, and she couldn't sit down, so she really struggled to walk around. There's women with small children, old elderly people. So I think it's really important that we make sure that these COVID restrictions aren't making spaces worse for people.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I've seen other sorts of similar concerns about places, you know, public bathrooms being locked to, like, you know, limit the amount of people that can use them. But of course, well, I mean, everybody needs a bathroom, but for some people that is a more urgent concern. People with like Crohn's, for example, who don't have time necessarily to like ask a dozen places if they can use the bathroom, or they're put in a very like kind of degraded position of having to explain the condition of their bowels in order to be able to access a bathroom. So I think in our kind of haste to try to like contain things, which obviously is important, we, again, like that kind of intersectional viewpoint has not been there, and so much of disability especially is kind of made invisible, right? Like we don't want to see or to notice disability, and of course there are many disabilities that don't immediately kind of show up on the outside of the body, and we're not trained to like think about those or to consider those. So yeah, it's a definite worry that kind of COVID restrictions could lead, I think they already have led, to greater marginalization of people with mental illness, for example, and people with physical disabilities.
Yeah, I guess as well, in terms of like access to public toilets, it's sort of moving away from the COVID thing. It's kind of like prioritizing the economy and big corporations at the expense of people all the time, where, you know, there's no real public toilets anymore in cities around the UK at least. So you kind of need to go into cafes or something, but now they've kind of put locks on all the doors and you have to buy something to use it, which is, you know, fair enough if they have to pay to maintain it. But if there's nowhere else for people to use, then it just kind of, it makes cities that much less accessible to people.
Yeah, and it's a, you know, the bigger question that this comes back to, I think, is one of like democracy in a way, right? If we think of like the origins of cities as kind of the birthplaces of democracy, and of democracy as about people, different people and different points of view coming together, mixing, being in the same physical spaces, that when you create a situation where some groups of people can't or won't or are excluded from accessing these places, and again, something as simple as not being able to use the bathroom means that a lot of people will not venture into those spaces, or can't stay for long, or whatever. I think it's anti-democratic. I think it creates a sort of breakdown in our sense of like what the diversity of our population in our cities really is. And certainly, you know, in the 1960s, for example, all of the disability movement activism was about saying, like, by excluding us from public spaces, you're excluding us from democracy. Like, we can't be part of society if there's no ramps or curb cuts or elevators or accessible washroom spaces. And I think the changes that happened because of those movements did help to bring disabled people into the public, right? And same with women, right? Not being able to be allowed to be in public without being a chaperone and all this kind of thing meant that we couldn't participate in democracy. So to me, it's, you know, it's also this like big question about just how we want to relate to one another and to our kind of our entire like political foundation in a sense.
Yeah, I think the way that cities kind of work, and like you said before about kind of individual family units kind of just staying within their own space and not really interacting with each other, I think almost works to prevent people coming together and actually reclaiming spaces and saying like, look, we don't want our city to work like this. So I think something like the collectivization of care, or just more public spaces, which I think has been recognised slightly throughout the COVID crisis. If you're only allowed out to exercise, but there's no spaces to exercise around you, I think that has come to the front a little bit. But I think, do you agree that kind of more public spaces would kind of help foster that collective spirit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think what we have come to think of as public space, and I do this with my students, I sort of, you know, like give them a list of all sorts of spaces and say, are these public or private? And we've come to, you know, we think of Starbucks as public space or shopping mall as public space because that's what's kind of been given to us as public space now, but really these are corporate owned spaces. They're not truly public, right? They're not for the people. And as you mentioned, Amy, so many of these spaces, they have a cost of entry, right? You are expected to consume something to be able to be in them. So I think expanding, you know, barrier-free, cost-free public space is absolutely essential to inclusivity and to the fact that maybe we don't want what happens in public space to be guided by the rules of a corporate owner of that space, right? That's not exactly the most democratic, I think, way to imagine what could happen in public space.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the like inadvertent effects of austerity has been that the only real public spaces we have now are these commercialized spaces.
100%, yep.
Yeah, I guess as well, maybe it's like a final question, don't want to keep you all night. How can we make men more aware of these issues that we face in cities and in urban spaces?
Beyond having them all read my book, I guess. But, you know, that's great. It's a great place to start. You know, I guess if I feel a little bit like kind of salty about it, I'll say I think there's like a lot of willful ignorance, right? A desire not to see the things that we don't want to see. And it's not just men who do that. I mean, white people do that when we don't want to see the effects of racism and so on. But when you have a certain amount of privilege, I think it's not that they can't see it, but they don't want to. It doesn't benefit them in any way. And in fact, it's challenging perhaps to privilege and to the status quo to see things differently. So part of it might be, I mean, you know, again, if I'm maybe less salty, I point out things like the kinds of things, for example, that I'm suggesting that make a feminist city would not take anything away from men, right? Like, in fact, they would make their lives much easier in many ways as well. Like physical accessibility, like we all need that or will need it at some point in our lives, right? Everybody, men, women, everybody. Having more access to bathrooms, having greater collective provision of care work, having greater safety, right? These things are not exclusive benefits for women and other marginalized groups, right? These are things that would make everybody's lives better. So pointing out that yeah, this is not really about elevating another segment of society above any other segment of society, but it's about finding ways to create cities that are as like supportive and functional and sustaining and fun, if you want as well, for everybody.
Yeah, I think there's like a whole issue with men just not understanding the basic ideas behind feminism and thinking that it's, you know, placing women above men. It's not. It's about equality between the sexes. You know, I've had so many men come at me on Twitter saying that feminism benefits women and not men. But yeah, I think definitely changing perceptions around what feminism is a big issue as well, and maybe sort of having personal experiences of feeling unsafe in different areas of the city would be a good idea as well, to kind of raise awareness of the different ways that it affects different people, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, I think unless you have anything that